All right, so we're on to our next region of the brain. And it's called the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia. So once again, we almost have a mid-sagittal cut. So the midline would be here. That would be a true mid-sagittal, but we did leave some structures out here on the lateral side of the midline. And those same structures are on the lateral side, on the right side of the cerebral hemisphere as well. All right, so the basal ganglia, first of all, there's some things that we need to get rid of. I know in years past you had to be able to identify the basal ganglia by sight. And the problem is it looks very similar to the limbic system. So part of the let me go and get rid of some of these things that are not part of the basal ganglia. First, here's the major commissure between the right hemisphere of the cerebrum and the left hemisphere. So that's the connection that allows each hemisphere of the cerebrum to talk to each other. It's not part of the basal ganglia, so let's go ahead and get rid of it. Let's go ahead and get rid of it. Let's go ahead and get rid of it. All right, there we go. We got rid of it. All right, so you can see right here we have what's called the fornix, and then we have the hippocampus and we have the amygdala. But these are not part of the basal ganglia. These are part of the limbic system. But you can see right here, this is the caudate nucleus. It looks very similar to the hippocampus. So you got to make sure that you don't get these confused. Usually just look for the little ball on the end of the hippocampus. That's the amygdala. So I'm going to get rid of some things that are not part of the basal ganglia. So let's go ahead and get rid of Mr. Hippocampus. Oh, all right, let's go ahead and try it again. Let's get rid of Mr. Hippocampus. Let's get rid of Mr. or Mrs. Amygdala. Let's go ahead and hide those. All right, so now we have the basal ganglia here for you. Let me get rid of that. So right here, this is called the putamen. First of all, most of the basal ganglia, what you're really going to need to know, and probably the only thing you're going to need to know, that it's important in initiating and also prohibiting or stopping unwanted muscle movements. So it's important in initiating muscle movements, and we all know, hopefully we know, if you watch the cerebrum, muscle movements are initiated by the primary motor cortex in the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, but it works hand in hand with parts of the basal ganglia. So the putamen here is a receiving part. It's going to transmit information that it gets down from the cerebrum, the primary motor cortex, going to pass it along, and working hand in hand, it's going to do going to assist in initiating muscle movements in the body. But it also is important in what's called procedural memory. So you have different kinds of memories. You have what's called declarative or episodic memory. And that's like, hey, I remember my 16th birthday. I remember my 16th birthday party. That's declarative or episodic memory. Where procedural memory is things like, hey, I know how to ride a bike. You may not remember exactly when you learned how to ride that bike, but procedural memory is stored in different places and it's stored differently than episodic or declarative memories. So remember, declarative memories are things in your past that you remember. You remember your graduation from 8th grade. But uh, procedural memory, that's more, hey, I know how to tie my shoes. Or, hey, I know how to drive a car. All right. But for the most part, the basal ganglia is going to work in tandem with the primary motor cortex to initiate and oftentimes to stop, to initiate motor movements that you want and to inhibit muscle movements that you don't want. All right, so first of all, some key parts of the basal ganglia. All right, so some key parts right here. We have the substantia nigra. Now, what this is important is it's important. You're not going to know, but one thing you might want to know: substantia nigra. When the neurons in this nuclei, this region of gray matter, a collection of neuronal cell bodies. When damage to these neurons occur, it's what causes Parkinson's disease. Remember, Parkinson's disease is characterized by people unable to inhibit muscle movements. So they can have really jerky movements just out of nowhere. So their brain is unable to inhibit these little muscle spasms. So the brain wants to do these spasms, but if your brain is working properly, especially the basal ganglia, it prohibits those muscle spasms that you see in Parkinson's disease. You also have the subthalamic nucleus. And I'm going to show you what that is kind of important here in a little while. You have the putamen. Once again, it's good in procedural memory. So, like tying your shoes or riding a bike or driving a car, important in that. And also the caudate nucleus. These kind of work hand in hand. All right, so you had the substantia nigra, you had the subthalamic nucleus, putamen, caudate nucleus, and then we can barely see back in here, just medial to the putamen, you have what's called the globus pallidus. Globus pallidus. And so those are the main parts of the basal ganglia: substantia nigra, subthalamic nucleus, putamen, caudate nucleus, and the globus pallidus. And I'm going to try to show you in this next little image how these things work together to help to initiate some muscle movements along with the primary motor cortex, and also to inhibit some muscle movements. All right, so in here we had a mid-sagittal section where I cut it into two lateral halves. The other, even though one part of the lateral half is disappeared. Well, on this next little image I'm going to show you, it's going to be a frontal or coronal section. So I'm going to cut it. I'm going to cut the brain. You're going to see it cut like this. So it's going to cut it into a anterior front and a posterior back section. All right, so now I'm going to try to show you how the basal ganglia assist with the primary motor cortex in initiating movements, and that's basically what you're going to need to know. So remember, this is a frontal or coronal section. So we're kind of looking from behind. We're looking towards the front of the brain. We're not looking at a side view like the mid-sagittal. We're looking from the back, looking towards the front. All right. So the first thing you know, the globus pallidus, its main job is it sends inhibitory. Put an I. Inhibitory. Remember, neurons can be both excitatory, which makes action potentials more likely to occur, and it's going to make the thalamus send signals to another part of the brain, or it can be inhibitory, which makes the thalamus say, hey, chill out, you don't need to do anything. So that's basically what the globus pallidus is doing. It's inhibiting the thalamus. And what that does is it inhibits the thalamus from sending random signals up to our primary motor cortex that could result in like spasms, muscle spasms. And that's what you have in Parkinson's disease. So that's what basically Parkinson's disease is. It's mainly with the substantia nigra, because it also has an inhibitory role with the thalamus. But it's basically the thalamus not being inhibited. And when it's not inhibited, it can send random signals up to the primary motor cortex, causing muscle spasms that you see in Parkinson's disease. Well, and this is called what's called the direct pathway. You're not going to need to know this. And do they know this for sure? No. Let's say the primary motor cortex says, hey, it's time to actually do some sort of muscle movement. Maybe, I don't know, lift your arm to raise your hand. All right, so the primary motor cortex will relay that either to the caudate nucleus or the putamen. And when that happens, the globus pallidus is going to stop inhibiting the thalamus. And when that happens, now the thalamus is able to relay that information back up to the primary motor cortex. and that motor action can be achieved. That's what initiates the motor movement. So it's basically the primary motor cortex sends a signal which causes the globus pallidus to stop inhibiting the thalamus, which allows the motion to occur. All right, so with a direct pathway, the globus pallidus is constantly suppressing or inhibiting the thalamus. And when motor stimulation comes down from the primary motor cortex into the caudate nucleus or the putamen, it stops the globus pallidus from inhibiting the thalamus, which causes the muscle movement to occur. There's also an indirect pathway, once again, not going to need to know this. And that goes with the subthalamic nucleus. Nucleus subthalamic is right below the thalamus. And it's like the opposite one where it doesn't stop inhibiting the thalamus. This is one where it's going to cause the globus pallidus to start inhibiting movement even more. And so where when when the brain is unable to keep the thalamus from being stimulated, when it has trouble inhibiting the thalamus, that leads to like Parkinson's disease because you get muscle contractions that you do not want. Now, in this indirect pathway where it actually causes the globus pallidus to inhibit the thalamus, this is more in what's another disease called Huntington's disease. So this is where in Parkinson's people have tremors and convulsions that they don't want and they don't uh, they're trying to inhibit. Where Huntington's disease is where people can't initiate any muscle movement at all. So they have trouble even starting. They don't have unwanted muscle movements. They have trouble starting them at all. All right. So that is the basal ganglia. Just know that it works hand in hand with the primary motor cortex and all those working together. The basal ganglia, the primary motor cortex, along with the thalamus, help to initiate and to control or inhibit muscle movements in the body.